Good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome. This evening, good evening, good afternoon. We're absolutely delighted that we have so many of you joining us tonight. Some of you will know that this is in fact the virtual replacement for our New York annual reunion. At Wadham, we go to North America a couple of times a year. Sadly, that hasn't been possible, but we're really delighted that we have Gordon Crovitz joining us tonight to share his wisdom and talk to us about fake news and how we can counter misinformation online. A topic that is sadly getting more and more relevant by the hour. But we have been absolutely thrilled to see how many alumni have been able to join us for these online events during the pandemic. And we are planning many more also for our North American friends. So delighted to see you here tonight and look out for more events in the coming month as well. But for now, I'm very, very pleased to hand over to the Warden of Wadham, Lord Macdonald, to welcome you all and to introduce our distinguished guests. Welcome.
Thank you, Julie. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see so many people here again at the latest in our series of online events. This is a very special one because this is an opportunity for us to thank our North American, Canadian alumni for their wonderful support over the years. Normally we travel to North America every year. This year we can't, and I'm not sure we'll be able to in the spring either. So this is another way for us to keep in contact. We have over 900 alumni in North America, an enormous number really, and some very strong and continuing friendships. And many of you are here tonight. Many of you have been extraordinarily generous to the college, both in terms of the time that you've given us, the benefactions that you've given us, and the friendship above all. So thank you all. It's a real pleasure to see you. We're going to have many more of these sorts of events in the future. And I'm sure even once the pandemic is over, we'll continue to do this because it's such a good way to keep in touch. Obviously, the last few months and the next few months bring stress to the college. It's a different way to deliver education to our young people. It's a different way for us to organize ourselves, but I've been enormously proud of the way the college has pulled together, the students, the academics and the staff. Everyone who lives and works here has really pulled together. There's an enormous sense of solidarity about the place, people supporting each other, people working to keep each other safe. And I think our students in particular have been remarkably impressive, and their forbearance in the face of this has been really, really tremendous, and we're proud of them. We have a very special and I think highly topical discussion this evening on the subject of fake news, and what could be a more appropriate time to be discussing this issue with the most important election in the world taking place now in less than a week. And all of us fascinated to learn what the outcome is going to be, although we're probably going to have to wait beyond next Tuesday or Wednesday to discover. But this is a very apposite time for us to be discussing news in particular and fake news. And we're absolutely delighted and honoured that Gordon Crovitz is going to lead this discussion and give us a presentation. Gordon is a Wadham lawyer, studied law in Wadham, matriculated in 1980, but moved on to better things than me and Jeffrey. He moved away from the law into quite an extraordinary career in publishing and journalism and commentary. Gordon is a media executive, a journalist, an advisor to media and technology companies. He's a former publisher, editorial board member, and columnist of the Wall Street Journal, one of the world's very greatest newspapers. And he's also served as an executive vice president of Dow Jones. So an enormously distinguished career, but most pertinently for us this evening, in 2018, he co-founded NewsGuard, which is an organization, a technology that rates the credibility and transparency of news and information websites, protects users from hoaxes, misinformation and fake news online. And this sounds to me like an extraordinarily valuable resource. And I'm delighted that Gordon has agreed to come to talk to the Wadham community about this this evening. So Gordon, thank you for joining us. Thank you for agreeing to speak this evening, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Warden, thank you so much for having me. On the one hand, I'm sorry that we're not in New York as we normally would be. On the other hand, I see from the benefits of Zoom that I have classmates on this Zoom call I otherwise would not see. And I had the chance briefly to catch up with Jeffrey Hackney, who was not only my law don, but had the heavy responsibility of being my moral tutor. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I wish I were here to talk to you about a cheerier topic than misinformation and the difficulty of knowing what sources to trust or what information is accurate. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about an effort to address that issue. And I think there are reasons to be optimistic that things may eventually get better, even if it is taking some good long time. So as the Warden mentioned, a couple of years ago, I co-founded a company called NewsGuard, and our idea was really quite simple, which was as more and more people get their news by thumbing through their Facebook feed or looking at Google search results, it's become increasingly difficult to have any idea whether a source in a social media feed or in a search result, whether that source is trustworthy or not trustworthy. Some of us in this meeting are old enough to remember going to the newsagent, picking among print publications, and we knew the differences among them. That's really not true on the internet. One of the great things about the internet is that everybody can be a publisher. One of the terrible things about the internet is that everybody can be a publisher, including people who are intentionally publishing false information or hoaxes of one kind or another. And the very simple idea that we had was, what if we gave news consumers more information about the sources that they saw in their social media feeds or in search results? And in other words, we saw this really as a problem of journalism, not so much a technology problem. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to, I think this will make it a bit faster and easier to follow. I'm going to share my screen here and just give you I hope you can see my screen. Yes?
Yes, we can. Gordon, can I just say, but I forgot to say at the beginning to people that we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. And you can either ask questions by typing them into the chat function or using the raised hand function, which you can find if you click on the participants button at the bottom of the bar and then just click the raised hand. So do ask questions as we go along on the chat function, or simply raise your hand at the end of Gordon's presentation, and we'll have plenty of time to take your questions. Thank you.
I look forward to that. What we've done is we have rated and created what we call nutrition label descriptions of all of the news and information websites that account for 95% of engagement online in the countries in which we operate, which currently are the US, UK, Germany, France, and Italy. And you can see on the screen, there are some criteria to do with credibility, some to do with transparency, and our journalistically trained analysts look at every site and try to determine how well they do on these basic apolitical criteria of journalistic practice. There are 9 criteria. Every site gets a point score. Sites get green ratings or red ratings. And you can see on the screen grab here what it might look like on someone's phone if somebody's trying to, this is a real website that pretends to be the BBC, is not at all the BBC. Or you can see in search results, green and red icons showing up. And if you are in your Facebook feed or wherever you might be, you can get more information about the source. This one, naturalnews.com, by the way, is an extraordinarily popular website, gets more traffic than the NIH, or here in the States, the CDC, full of healthcare hoaxes, 5G causing COVID-19, masks being dangerous to wear, that sort of thing. And the nutrition label looks something like this. This is RT, the Russian disinformation site. These can be quite long. There's a detailed description of the nature of the site, who owns it, who runs it, what their standards are, with footnotes and all sorts of things to give readers more information about the nature of the source. And the reason that we did it this way is that we live in an era where trust is a rare commodity in any institution, certainly among news publishers. And for us, we thought that if we were transparent about the 9 criteria, if we rated everybody just the same way, and if we detailed all of the work transparently, that would be kind of the opposite of a Silicon Valley algorithm. As I think you know, the digital platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others, they actually have ratings for news publishers themselves. A trusted site gets better placement, but those algorithms are secret. Even the publisher doesn't know what the ratings are, doesn't know how to improve. And in my experience anyway, the Silicon Valley companies, their news judgment is probably about on par with my ability to code. You know, that's not their thing. And it does take some experience to have news judgment, just as I'm sure it does to code. And they've never wanted to exercise editorial judgment. And perhaps we can get into this in part of the discussion. They're under a lot more pressure now to reduce the harm that occurs on their platforms. And one way, of course, they could do that would be to give people more information about the sources on their platforms. So that's a little description of NewsGuard. By the way, I think there's some students on the Zoom. If you're a student at Oxford, you can get free access to NewsGuard through your Turnitin account. And if you live in the UK and BT happens to be your broadband provider, you can also get it for free that way. Otherwise, it's delivered through sort of Microsoft and some other services. But let me stop there, Warden, in case you have questions about what I've said, or if you'd like to turn to other topics.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, there are all sorts of ideas floating around about how we might deal with fake news. Yours is a form of technology which people can download and use and use reliably. There are other ideas that, for example, people like Twitter, people like Facebook should have some responsibility for what for their content, in the sense that they should be treated as publishers rather than just a platform. I wonder what your view is about that.
Yeah, well, I never felt actually that I left the law. If you're somebody in journalism in the States, legal training is really quite important, and that's true also now for the digital platforms. As some of you may know, at the very beginning of the commercial internet in the 1990s, the US Congress passed a law, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, that essentially created immunity for digital platforms for the content on their platforms. And the idea at that time was, this is a new technology, let's not burden it with regulation. I wrote several columns over the years saying that was a wonderful idea. I think now, after 25 years, we can say we had a quarter-century social experiment with the idea of excluding one industry from centuries of common law duties of care. And I think we've seen the result, which is that if you instruct an industry like the social media companies, the search companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others, if you tell them they're not responsible for what they do, then we should not be surprised that they've grown into irresponsible platforms. There's a lot of discussion now led actually in the UK. There was an online harms white paper done last year identifying this issue and suggesting that the digital platforms be held to the same duty of care other industries are being held. There was actually a hearing just today in the US Senate on an approach quite similar to that the UK pioneered. So I do think we're living at a time when the downside of what the digital platforms have made possible is so clear to people that the current regulatory regime seems unlikely to survive.
I mean, that's quite a dramatic statement because if there was a more rigorous regulatory regime, and to be fair to Mark Zuckerberg, he's indicated that he wouldn't be opposed to some form of regulation, wouldn't that dramatically change their business model, the way they operate? If they did begin to acquire responsibility for what was published on their sites, they would have to have in place a whole system of internal regulation and surveillance, wouldn't they, in order to achieve that?
I think they would. These are among the wealthiest companies in the world. They have the resources to do it. I think you're quite right. The Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter and the CEO of Google, have all said in one way or another, please regulate us. I'm always a little bit alarmed when I see people saying that because it can also suppress competition. They are very large companies. But I think what I think is most likely is there will be a form of responsibility. I don't think it will get to the point where, for example, Facebook would have to read every post before it goes live, or that YouTube would have to review every video of a family reunion before it goes live. I think that would be onerous. But there are reasonable steps that the platforms could take, particularly with regard to the many, many publishers of misinformation and hoaxes that really dominate in many areas, particularly, by the way, in the area of healthcare. The number of COVID-19 hoaxes and vaccine hoaxes, the popularity of those sites and social media pages really is quite impressive. And if readers had a better sense of why they should proceed with caution, I think the platforms would do everyone some good if they were to do that. I think it also raises, Warden, the question, unspoken so far, but maybe the only thing worse than the digital platforms not taking responsibility for their actions would be if governments were to regulate the content on the platforms. So I do think there's an effort to try to avoid that. That would be an unhappy outcome for democratic societies. And I think there are ways around that problem, but I think people are rightly quite sensitive to that risk as well.
I mean, one can see why they shy away from it. I'm sure there's a commercial reason, but there's also this reason that it's a terribly difficult job to do. I mean, you look at the way different political tendencies in the United States attack Facebook or Twitter for their stance on particular forms of speech. So Trump and his supporters get terribly upset when one of Trump's tweets has a warning attached to it. The Republicans talk about, Silicon Valley having a war on Republicans. Democratic inclined people probably point towards conspiracy theory sites and so on. So they're between a rock and a hard place in some respects, aren't they?
They are, but it is in the nature of how they operate to encourage conspiracy theorists and to encourage people to be skeptical about them. Yeah. Their algorithms are dark secrets, how some content is promoted and other content is demoted. They don't have transparent criteria at all. Those are among the proposals, that they should disclose their algorithms. They should report on what steps they've taken. I should say that something as simple as giving readers more information about the nature of news sites that they run across on the internet has a dramatic impact on what people read and what people share. People don't want to share false information. They don't want to be known as, crazy Uncle Willie, the person who sends, the COVID-19 hoax stories or other stories. And so the data all say that if people have some sense that they're dealing with unreliable information, they'll be careful and they won't share it nearly so much. That's why I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
That there are solutions there if only the digital platforms will take reasonable steps.
So we have plenty of questions building up. Mark Steele says that Facebook and Twitter have recently been taking some action to counter misinformation on their platforms. How sincere and effective do you consider these steps are and will be?
I would say they have taken steps in the right direction. I would call them baby steps, quite small steps. Twitter, for example, is now posting at the top of many people's feed, in their news feed in Twitter. You may have, in the US, for example, they would post, you may have seen that mailing in your voting ballots is fraudulent or was likely to be fraudulent. Click here to learn more about it. And that's a form of pre-bunking. In other words, they're trying to anticipate an issue that somebody may see and debunk it before somebody actually has seen it. I think that's quite a good idea. The conspiracy, there are academics who are quite knowledgeable about conspiracy theories, what drives them. It's a well-studied topic. And delivering factual information to people right as they're seeing a claim, or possibly even before they've seen it, is much more effective than waiting for fact checkers to investigate the matter and hours or days or even weeks later post something that says what you read 3 weeks ago wasn't true.
We had an event 3 or 4 weeks ago about artificial intelligence and some of the issues, ethical and otherwise, surrounding it. And Peter Berners-Lee asked this question: how can platforms possibly keep up with content without using AI? And doesn't AI have its own issues?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. That is one reason why at NewsGuard, we call ourselves an HI company, human intelligence, not AI. And we're rating at the domain or the publisher level. We're not trying to chase every story. And I think the experience so far of AI with regards to fake news is it doesn't really work very well. Some of you may remember in the 2016 election in the States, there was a report in a publication online called the Denver Guardian that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. The Denver Guardian, to somebody on the internet, looked like a regular newspaper website. It actually looked very much like the Denver Post, which is a 150-year-old newspaper. But it was actually a hoax website. Artificial intelligence can't tell the difference between those websites. It's even hard for humans to do it. So I think there's a real limit to what AI can do. On the other hand, AI does have some benefits. The World Health Organization worked with some ad technology companies and with us at NewsGuard in order to deliver World Health Organization medical advice to more than 1 billion people who had seen in their social media feeds a COVID-19 hoax. So we were able to work with companies using AI. We identified the publishers who had published those hoaxes, and the AI was able to identify the people who had read the hoaxes, and the ad tech companies were able to deliver mitigating information to the people who had seen the hoaxes. So I think there is a role for AI, but quite right, when it comes to false information, I don't think AI is going to be the solution anytime soon.
Well, Nancy B has a question which might underline that. She says she had an experience recently where she shared a BBC news story about the use of face shields versus masks, which reported on a Japanese study, and it was flagged, presumably by AI, as promoting false information, and she got a 3-day ban. So this is for sharing a BBC news story. So that there's, well, I assume there's something going wrong there.
Yeah, it may have been a case of false positive. I don't really know, but the one thing I do know is it's not easy to appeal those decisions. There's not a phone number you can call or an email address made available to users to say, ask what's going on. And I think it goes to the broader point that the digital platforms grew up with a culture of secrecy, and everything about how they operate has been secret. They would say for competitive reasons, or they would say they didn't want people to game their system. I think when it comes to information and news, actually transparency and disclosure is by far the better approach. That, the best way to counter bad information is with good information. The worst thing to do is to censor or secretly to demote. Much better to give people factual information and let them make up their own minds.
Yeah.
So I think the platforms, by suppressing information, by censoring information, actually feed the conspiracy-minded, and it's really the wrong approach.
Yeah, and that Derek Cannon may be making a similar point where he says, is fake news any more than a technologically enabled extension of propaganda? And if it is, why shouldn't people be allowed to spread, he doesn't say this, I'm adding to his question, why shouldn't people be allowed to spread propaganda if they want to?
Yeah, I think that's not a bad definition for our modern digital age. I think there may be a qualitative difference given the speed at which information travels through social media, but also given the nature of the algorithms, which are designed to maximize engagement. And so the more emotional, outrageous, hate-filled the post is, the more engagement there is, the more advertising views there are, the more revenue to the digital platform. So it would be, I guess, as if Goebbels, had an advertising-based support for his propaganda. I think married with our modern technology, we would say that that was, even more dangerous than what he had at his disposal in the 40s.
Nancy B points out that she did try to appeal, and her appeal was rejected in 3 seconds by Facebook, who said it was a legitimate ban. So we can only assume that that appeal wasn't considered by a human being.
3 seconds, even for a very bright Facebook executive would be awfully fast.
Yeah. So Fred Riz says, he has 2 questions. First of all, he says, NewsGuard is basically a meta site. What makes meta sites any more trustworthy than the sites on which they report?
Yeah, very good question. That is why we adopted a policy of radical transparency with everything that we did. So the 9 criteria are transparent. On our website, we've got in-depth discussions of each of the 9 criteria. When we rate a news site, actually, if it looks like they're going to fail on any of the 9 criteria, our analysts reach out to them. And in many cases, the site will say, oh, I didn't realize that I should have a corrections policy. That's one of our 9 criteria. Even the Times of London actually made improvements to its disclosure in order to get a higher score from us. And so I think operating with that level of disclosure and transparency gives people the chance to look at the work, decide for themselves what they think of it, choose to trust it or not trust it. But at least they have the option of understanding the nature of the criteria and the judgments. And at least so far, I think we've had good reception on all sides of all political sides. I think mostly because we treat every website just the same with the same criteria.
Yeah. So David Mitchell asked this, that Cambridge Analytica's influence on the US election and the UK Brexit vote in 2016 was not via fake news, but by carefully directed nudges. So how could NewsGuard protect against this, or would it want to? Is this an area that you'd want NewsGuard to be involved in?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the platforms are brilliant media to reach people with messages. That's why they've captured such an enormously high percentage of advertising revenue. In many, many cases, the misinformation, the hoaxes that spread the most on the internet spread because people can cite what appears to be an authoritative source, a website that looks like an authoritative website. And in the many, many cases where those are hoax websites, disinformation sites, sites that routinely publish false content, sites that have a business model of generating ad revenue from false content, in those cases, by giving users more information about the nature of the source, it at least would reduce the popularity of it. Warden, you're right. There are quite a few vices that the digital platforms need to address, and NewsGuard addresses only some of them. Yeah,
so Camille Singleton asks, can fake news be countered through technical solution software alone, or as a population, do we have a responsibility to enhance our awareness of tactics used by fake news propagators and change the way we consume this news?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to write code so that AI itself could identify false information. I think it's incumbent on all of us to become more news literate. At NewsGuard, we do have a tool that is married with AI, which can find all versions of a particular hoax or example of misinformation anywhere on the internet using AI. And so there are, and then platforms or intelligence agencies or whoever can take steps to mitigate the downside of those hoaxes and misinformation. But I think, the very simple question of, is this claim true, is one that AI is not able to answer in the first instance. It can help identify other versions of a falsehood, but it does take humans to determine whether something is true or not true.
So that leads nicely into a question from Jeremy Hodge, which asks whether the education system needs to fundamentally change so that we teach people no longer to treat content as true by default. I mean, I guess when I was a child, I sort of assumed if I read something in a newspaper or saw something on the television news, my working assumption would be that it was true. And that would be probably the case for anyone of my age or older. I don't know what age. I mean, certainly that wouldn't be the view of my kids, including those who are now in their mid to late 30s. That certainly is not their default position. So at some stage, something changed. And maybe it changed before the internet. I don't know. But I don't think people do any longer treat content as true by default, do they? I think people are suspicious.
I think there's been an effort to try to increase news literacy, including at the schooling level. On the other hand, I have some school-age kids, and I was surprised a couple of weeks ago where the news literacy material included the advice that if the website is a .org website, that you should trust it. There are actually people who have purchased .org domains in order to publish hoax information, leveraging the trust that ought to be in a .org domain, which is supposed to be a nonprofit, and therefore theoretically, potentially at least less conflicted. And so I think, we're really at the very beginning of understanding news literacy in this area. It's much more like, being an historian and trying to understand original source materials from the past. And historians have developed techniques for doing that. It's quite difficult. I think we're now in a position where we all have to do it for journalism, which is only the first draft of history.
An issue that's arisen recently in the States is around the New York Post story about Hunter Biden. And this is a very interesting example, isn't it? Because it's a kind of Fox News New York Post story that other newspapers, other mainstream newspapers have declined to take up for a variety of reasons, including, I think, the Wall Street Journal, which decided that it couldn't verify some of the material and didn't publish the story. And Mark Henley says this: to suppress or not to suppress is a tricky question, where we have disclosures to WikiLeaks and the New York Post have unsubstantiated or difficult to substantiate stories being used tactically to influence voters. Isn't it right to prevent bad actors from manipulating elections with these sorts of unverifiable disclosures? I guess the question is, how do we identify the bad actors and how do we prevent them from doing that?
Yeah, I would certainly say that that example is some evidence that the Silicon Valley companies are very good at many things, but news judgment is not one of them. You know, this is a case of, as you may have read, what appeared to be emails on a laptop reportedly owned by Joe Biden's son. And Twitter and Facebook both took immediate actions against it, claiming that it looked illegitimate in some way. In the week or so since then, that decision has not looked very good. It may not have proved that Joe Biden was personally involved in any of the discussions, but neither his campaign nor Hunter Biden has denied the accuracy of the emails, or that it wasn't his laptop, or anything like that. So, you know, there are many, many times when news outlets will publish information that was not meant to be public. A couple of months ago, the New York Times had a terrific investigative piece on Donald Trump's tax returns. It's actually a federal crime to publish tax information, but in the States, journalists violate laws like that all the time, and I think should. The Pentagon Papers would have been another example, WikiLeaks, another example. I think, you know, to make news judgments about the news value of something is something that a journalist should do, and those publishers will be credited or criticized for what they do in terms of how they treat news topics. But I think it's an excellent example, actually, of a situation whereby censoring, making it actually impossible for people on Twitter to share the original story, that has inflamed a third of the country, 40% of the country in the States. And it creates the divisions in the society that I think the digital platforms thought they were trying to reduce.
Well, it looked partisan, didn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, you know, politics being politics, politicians made the most of it and continue to do so, and will through the election, and regardless of the outcome of the election, probably after the election.
But I mean, obviously the timing of it was sort of deeply suspicious as a kind of manufactured October surprise. But what surprised me was how quickly some of the liberal media latched on to a kind of suggestion that this was a Russian stunt, without any real evidence that it was a Russian stunt. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence at all this was a Russian stunt. It may have been something that was manufactured by somebody, but I haven't seen any evidence that it was manufactured by the Russians.
You know, I think there's bound to be some soul searching among the left-wing media in the US for failing to cover the story.
Yeah.
And the Wall Street Journal, you're quite right, Warden, looked at the story and reported that there's no evidence in the emails that Joe Biden himself was involved. There were references to somebody who could have been Joe Biden, but in the emails themselves, no clear evidence. So I think there are ways to report on stories like that that are quite responsible, actually communicate what's relevant and what's true and what's not true. I think by refusing to cover the topic, that's where people have less trust in media and are more apt to believe the worst.
Yeah. Oliver Forrest asks a question which I think gets to the heart of the the business model, which we mentioned earlier, and I think you've alluded to this as well as being one of the problems in terms of the way social media deals with news. So he says that if online news distributors make their money by selling advertising space on their sites, which is predicated on engagement, clicks, as the primary metric, how can we incentivize them against publishing content which is more concerned with breaking news sensationalism than in-depth fact checking and the drier search for truth? I mean, that gets at the heart of it, really, doesn't it?
I think it does. I think the business model of the platforms is terribly simple. They want to maximize the page views, the articles, the posts, the searches that people do on their platforms, because that's converted to advertising revenue. Imagine a different world. This is an interesting thought experiment, perhaps. Imagine a world where there were a competitor to Facebook or to Google that was designed for users and not for advertisers. There's a lovely saying that if you're not paying for the product, then you're the product being sold. And that is how we are with Facebook and with Google and with YouTube and with Twitter. We're all being sold. Our attention is being sold. So imagine instead a digital platform that had a subscription basis, where it got most of its revenues from readers or users rather than from advertisers. I think that would be a quite different platform. We've certainly seen in the news media, I think there was a time when, and you could read the Times of London or the Guardian. Well, the Guardian is still free online, but it's an exception, or the Telegraph or the Sun, free of charge online. And they've moved, because advertising is so difficult for traditional news publishers, they've moved more and more to a reader-oriented revenue stream. And I think the editors would say that's improved the quality of their work. They're not chasing clickbait stories. They're not chasing entertaining stories, gossipy stories, as much as maybe they were before, because they're focused on how do they create journalism that people are willing to pay for. So I don't have a timeline for when there might be a social media platform or a search engine that does well by focusing on subscription revenue as opposed to advertising revenue, but I do think that's what it will take fundamentally to change the business model of the platforms.
It's interesting you mentioned The Guardian, because they've moved, and they're moving quite strongly now, if you ever read the site, to the membership model. So trying to persuade people to become members and contributing money as members of The Guardian. And I mean, I've had this discussion with Alan Rusbridger, actually, who's a head of house here in Oxford, who edited The Guardian for a long time. I think there's a real danger there that the newspaper turns into a sort of echo chamber, and readers become members because they somehow subscribe to the values of the paper very clearly and quite intensely. And it therefore becomes more and more difficult for the newspaper to publish material that might not be acceptable within that sort of membership universe. And I'm not sure myself that's a very attractive model if one wants more of a diversity of views. What do you think about that?
I think it's an urgent issue. I think that for news publishers that are focused on readers, that's wonderful in many ways, much better to be focused on readers than advertisers. As a practical matter, news publishers focus on that incremental potential subscriber. What is it that will lead somebody to become a member of The Guardian or a subscriber to the New York Times or whatever the example might be? And for some of those news brands, the reason people subscribe is an affinity for the brand, an affinity for that worldview, whatever it might be. And so, Warden, I do think there's a risk that will push the coverage to be narrower and narrower in order to make subscribers feel at home. When I ran the Wall Street Journal, the main bonus metric for the Wall Street Journal's news department was how well the journal did in an annual survey that was done by a research group in the States called the Pew Research Center, that measured the trustworthiness of news brands. And the bonus was based on how well the journal did in being trusted by liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. And the journal has, I think, this is still true, is finished number one in that category because that has been the focus of the news coverage. The opinion pages of the journal, of course, for those of you who read it, are anything but down the middle. They're quite distinctive in the point of view. But the news pages of the journal, I think, have continued to do a good job of trying to be down the middle. And true. People, and Warden, the journal is lucky because, like the FT, the reason people subscribe to it is they've got an interest in business or finance primarily. And they don't want a biased take on business or finance. That could cost them money. And so I think that risk is maybe in that way a bit greater for the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian, or the New York Times and the Washington Post.
So Mark Steele says, and I certainly take this point, that the membership model is still not as dangerous as being focused on an owner with an agenda, and that would certainly be true in the case of an activist owner who was wanting to essentially dictate the line that the newspaper should take. So there are advantages and disadvantages with both. I get this sense. I read the Guardian and I read lots of newspapers. I read the Guardian and the New York Times regularly every day, I guess. I get the sense that they've more and more, those two papers in particular, have become echo chambers in a way that has been destructive to the quality of some of the journalism. That may be an unpopular view here, but that's a sort of sense I have. I don't know what you feel about that.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite true. I think it's probably true of right of center publications as well.
Yeah.
I think in the context of our discussion around news literacy, I think there are going to be some news brands that try to position themselves as being inherently trustworthy and non-biased. I think the charter of the BBC requires the BBC to make efforts to be unbiased. And I think that positioning in the news market may become increasingly valuable.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to find, there's a question, yes, from Laura Ziv, who says, how do you see misinformation trending over the next 5 to 10 years, and how hopeful or alternatively despairing are you?
Yeah, I don't think that we're going to get a great solution overnight. I think it's going to take some time. I think, it may be that the online harms legislation being considered in the UK is the first national legislation that really addresses this issue. I think it's the farthest along. I don't think people would say it's likely to happen, in the next several months, but it is the one that's the most advanced. And I think that could have a significant impact. I think it could encourage the government and the states to have similar reforms of the law. But as with everything, it will take some time for those new standards and greater duties to become part of how the digital platforms operate. And in the meantime, we certainly see foreign state actors making the most of digital platforms for their disinformation. In the area of healthcare, there's a tremendous amount of money being made by hoax websites, not only from advertising, but also by selling nutritional supplements directly. That's the business model for many of them. In other words, to try to find anxious people, maybe gullible people, feed them information to make them yet more anxious, and then sell them a miracle cure, a subscription to fruit pips or something like that, which is marketed as a cure for cancer.
I mean, this is. I think this is because so there's political misinformation. There are all sorts of types of misinformation, but health information is particularly worrying, isn't it? And I have in mind something that's raised as a question by Fiona Schaffler, which is, I mean, vaccination, anti-vax propaganda is seems to me to be a terribly concerning issue, and it's highlighted by the pandemic. You see very alarming polling numbers about the proportion of populations in advanced Western societies who'd refuse to take a vaccine if it became available.
Yeah.
So this is an urgent question. I mean, some of the material you alluded to at the beginning, C5, G5 masks causing cancer and causing COVID and so on. I mean, this sort of material is quite easy to identify and ought to be relatively easy to remove.
It should be. It is quite popular. Even before COVID-19, you may recall, in North America and parts of Europe, measles had returned in great number because people had fear of the vaccine for their children. That's only been accelerated with COVID-19. And Warden, you're quite right. In the States, there's some surveys that half the population would refuse to take a vaccine. I've seen similar data from the UK that about a third of people in the UK would refuse to take a vaccine. There's a tremendous amount of misinformation that's been published. A couple of examples. Bill Gates has a patent on COVID-19, and that's why he's investing so much for a vaccine. The vaccine will come with a chip that will follow you around. I mean, there are all sorts of ridiculous hoaxes. The World Health Organization actually reached out to us over the summer, and they said that they had gotten the digital platforms to agree that they would try to mitigate COVID-19 and vaccine misinformation on their platforms. But the WHO people said they couldn't keep up with all the hoaxes. So every week we actually send them all the latest hoaxes that we've found. And every week there are more. And they're around the world. Most of them originate in the States. I guess I should be proud to say that. But there are shockingly different ones in Germany and in Italy and in the UK. And the hoax that the 5G technology caused COVID-19 took hold the most in the UK.
Yeah.
And it's quite concerning to the broadband companies. They've actually had their workers be attacked by people.
Well, we've been having that. We had that well before the pandemic. People installing 5G masks being abused, and some of the masks being attacked and damaged as a result of these sorts of quite extraordinary conspiracy theories. And we recently seen in London in anti-lockdown protests, people holding up queues. So, QAnon is now beginning to gain some adherence here. And it's quite alarming that people believe that sort of stuff, but there are plenty who do.
And I do think it does go back to the topic we discussed earlier, which is it's so much better to give people more information about something like vaccines than to censor false claims. Censoring false claims leads people to think, oh, there must be something there, must be something to it. So much better to have counter factual information with reliable sources.
Well, can we just finish with a question about the election, Gordon? So, as a former senior commentator on the Wall Street Journal, I think you will have a judgment that we would be interested to hear about this. Kathy McLeod Bateman asks, so this is the first part of the question. Her question is, can you give us your view of how fake news could affect the US vote next week? And I'm going to add to that as a final question, once you've dealt with her question, what do you think is going to happen next week?
I'd rather answer hers than yours. There is certainly quite a bit of misinformation about the election itself. We actually just put out a report today on leading hoaxes relating to the logistics of voting in the States. And I do fear that in the run-up to the election, some of these misinformation sites will make false claims intentionally to suppress voting about the logistics of voting. So I think that is clearly a risk for this election, and I suppose elections in other countries as they happen. In terms of predicting the outcome of this election, on the one hand, I take some pride in having predicted that Trump was going to win the last election.
Yeah, you did.
Um, this one, I think, is very hard to call. I think Trump supporters are unlikely to be honest with poll surveyors, and I'm skeptical that poll surveyors have found a way around that problem. It's a known unknown,
Mm.
but I think it's a difficult problem to solve. On the other hand, I don't think the polls are wrong that there's a broad view that, there's an argument for something a bit more normal than many people think the country has with President Trump. So on this one, I think it's hard to call, and it could go either way. The polls could be right, in which case we'll know the day of the voting. We'll know.
And actually, the polls last time round, towards the end, weren't as wrong as people now believe they were. They weren't that wrong. I mean, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote by a point or two, and that's about where the polls were by election day, as I recall. I mean, they were much more volatile last time round, weren't they?
Yeah, well, that's right. And for those of you in Europe or not in the U.S. time zone, the fastest way to figure out what happened is just to watch the results in Florida and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
The rest, I think you probably don't have to worry about. But if the president wins both of those, or if Joe Biden wins both of those, then I think the election probably will.
Yeah.
Will be.
And of course, those states, those kind of what we would call floating states, the polls are much tighter in those states than they are in other places. So it's going to be it won't be a long night. It'll be a long couple of days, I should think.
Yeah. Well, in honor of the classmates I see on this call, I don't know if any of them remember this, but in 1980, I applied to vote by mail. I had lived in Chicago, Illinois before. Some of you may know the reputation of Chicago as a entrepreneurial place for many things, including voting. Mayor Daley at that time had ambitious views of who could vote, people in cemeteries and others. Anyway, I was sent 4 ballots to vote in the 1980 presidential election. And I thought it was only fitting that I gave one of them to my British classmates to do with what they wanted. I voted the other 3.
Well, I hope they didn't vote. You voted them. Yeah. Well, John Kennedy, of course, famously stole Chicago, didn't he, in 1960, and wouldn't have been president if he hadn't. Or Mayor Daley stole it for him.
I think that's a correct reading of political history.
Yeah. Well, listen, Gordon, I think that's been a really fascinating discussion, and thank you very much indeed for joining us and for giving us those insights. I think we're going to be on the edge of our seats for the next few days, but I do think that we've been discussing one of the central issues, not just for that election, but for the next few years. How on earth we're going to deal with this sort of Wild West, and how we're going to deal with it without kind of crude censorship or government control, whether self-regulation is going to work, or whether your sort of option, which looks very, very persuasive, can work. It's going to be fascinating to see over the next few years how this plays out. Thank you very, very much for joining us. And thank you everyone else for joining us. Please keep in touch with us by going regularly on our website. And we're going to, as I say, be doing lots of events in the coming months. Not all of them at 10 o'clock UK time, most of them 6 o'clock UK time. Some of you are beginning to look a bit bleary-eyed. But please do, if you visit our website regularly, you'll see a variety of very interesting events featuring alumni, Wadham fellows, and other interesting and fascinating people in the months ahead. So please do keep joining us, and when you can, visit us. And thank you for your tremendous support. We have some wonderful buildings, 2 wonderful buildings going up at the moment in the back quad that you'll remember well. Some of you will remember the Goddard building that was in the back quad, which wasn't one of the most distinguished buildings in the Wadham estate. That's gone, and we have 2 glorious new, very modern, beautiful, graceful buildings about to open. And again, you can see details of those on our website, and there is still opportunity to sponsor those buildings, to sponsor doors, bricks, staircases, rooms, tables, anything you'd like to sponsor is available to be sponsored. Some of you on this call have already helped us tremendously and with extraordinary generosity, and we're very grateful to you. Anyone else who wants to chip in, we'd be more than happy for you to do so. But thank you anyway for your support, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.